Most welcome to 1744 of the series. I will today talk about aspect seeing, and something we discussed extensively in connection with authors Paul Johnston, Wittgenstein, Rethinking the Inner, Joachim Schulte, Expression and Experience and Expression, and Ohad Nachdomi, who wrote a paper of aspect blindness and meaning blindness. And especially in the latest mentioned rather short article, it is thanks also, of course, to what we learn from Paul Johnston and Joachim Schulte. It became clearer with the help of Ohad Nachdomi and Andreas Blank, I think the name of the co-author was, that aspect is the same as seeing meaning. To see one thing is actually to see, so to speak, many things at the same time. And that is one of the, maybe the deepest meaning of the ambiguous figure of the duck rabbit. And that is, language itself is made as this ambigram. It's only that there are more than two sides to language. There are several. And in order to be able to understand language, we need to be able also to see aspects as they come. And this is, of course, in, I would say, an incredibly sharp contrast to the normally perceived idea that to see a thing is to see it just once, directly. The Platonic idea of an ideal form that is immediately recognized from one angle. And the more you think of it, the less it makes any sense whatsoever. It's somewhere in that process it stops making any sense at all. Think of a face. How often do you see it from one singular perspective? I'd say that that is the sort of thing that almost never happens. And recognizing a person as one singular individual takes seeing it differently every time. And despite the Platonic, overwhelmingly convincing foundational structure, seeing something as one means seeing it as an aspect. It doesn't have this eerie supernatural idea of identity. That is the mistaken picture that underlies everything That's a part of our captivity, so to speak. We need to understand that aspect seeing also is how we acquire language, how we progress in language, and that language is a language game, but progressing within language is in itself yet another game where you discover the rules as you try it out. That's extremely far from the fixed common view that language is artificial science somewhere existing in the transcendental language world, and in some odd way they have a possibility of referring to things in the world by possibly very thin lines of meaning in between them. That's all that binds them together. Instead, language with aspect is deeply intertwined with everything that we do, the acts. And I'd say this is not completely correct, but the smallest acts are built out of aspects. The aspect change is the smallest atom of the act. This is making a bit of violence of Wittgenstein's text, but I think it could actually serve as a starter up, giving some introductory understanding into what aspect does. So, to sum that up, identity is in itself an aspect. It is not the identification of sameness somewhere out in the transcendental world. But you see just one aspect of something, and in that particular case it's correct to say same. It means nothing beyond that, nothing less, nothing more. It doesn't mean that an individual is self-identical or something, or that that person is unique in some ways, or that each atom has its unique existence somewhere. None of those metaphysical transcendental things are implied by that. It simply means I have an aspect I don't see. Most probably you don't see something you ever seen before. It's the first time you see that. And still you word it same. Because it is a word in the language game. It has a working function. We're not looking for identity. We're not looking for something beyond what we are saying. I'd say all those add-ons comes from the uncalled for urge for extra explanations. Explanations that makes us lose the contact with the real game. Once more, it's most probably the football game depicted by Monty Python between Western philosophers and Asian philosophers, I think it was. They lose the game by not even understanding the introductory rules to the playoff, which is be aware of what you are doing. Not overly aware either, but be aware enough of what you are, where the point is. I think that's maybe one of the most important recent understandings we had in this lecture series, and that is that each part of the language game has a most specific point to it, and that point is of the greatest importance, not to be fuddled with. The point is lacking in the Platonic or Augustinian view. There's no point, everything is pointless, doesn't serve a purpose, and therefore it's not real. It's not participating in any way in anything. So oddly enough, there is nothing real with a philosophical direction realism. None at all. Famous quote by Paul Feyerabend, it's not even wrong. It's just nonsensical. A misconstructed sentence that doesn't mean anything to the one saying it and doesn't have any meaning for anyone else for that matter. That's one of the reasons why it could be good to referring to the philosopher's football game. The second reason is, of course, that Wittgenstein himself was, from the very beginning, at least by hearsay, inspired by a football game for his understanding of die Sprachspiele. Maybe the most important neologism of Wittgenstein. It opens up for great understanding and after the establishment of a language game, that also made it possible to understand aspect. To see that there is an acute phase, if you like, of aspect where it is in its very beginning, when it's starting to take form, and then how it becomes chronic. And in that stepwise process that is progressive, doesn't have a clear stop or a start, That is where objects, details of the world comes to the fore. Aspect can also, I think it could be added to my suggestion of using the model of the kaleidoscope that constantly changes. But you need to go from the idea of change to the idea that there is recognition of stillness is a form of aspect change. It doesn't make much progress just to go from staticness to a sort of movement in the idea of what is. One needs to understand that aspect change in its acute manner and its chronic phase is what builds up all the different tones and shades in between. Something that could be called a first loose grip or a soft dream of something resembling reality, and then the whole scale that goes to something more established. I think a good example of that are some ambigrams works the way that you can only see two things in the beginning, and after a while you get fixated on one and the other one disappears almost completely. It becomes fixated. That's the chronic phase. The chronic phase that means we are no longer aware that there was different aspects to it. The aspect delivery is so quick, it's simultaneous. There is no possibility of seeing it as an ambigram or triagram or all its different aspects, and then we are habituated, conditioned to only one thing, so to speak. But underneath that, it's still aspects going on. A new aspect participating in the game, almost like a football player doing a pass. Never the same, and never not the same either. But it's still a pass, can be identified as a pass. And without doing further metaphysical wanderings about that, it's identical, you could say, in everyday language, but don't overdo it. The moment you start wondering why, that's the very moment you start losing that softness of understanding. Everything becomes fixated. No longer lenient, soft and nice. Hardened, resolute, non-negotiable understandings. And these become fossilized, and you have in the end people who are practicing analytical philosophy, who doesn't really move about in their bodies. They lose the flexibility of aspects. And since aspects are, in my suggestion here today, my very own approach, that they are the prime movers or the atoms of the whole thing, everything above will be also fixated, will be not movable, neither still. They will be chaotic or nondescript. They will not make sense anymore. It's a lesser game, because one of the important factors that doesn't exist in analytical philosophy and very much in the everyday jargon is factors like quality. Not all words and concepts in the language game are equal. None, actually. We need to find our ways in the language games. And it's not an easy task, but realizing aspect is very important first step. It makes it possible to go further and make an excursion and development within the language game. So we're no longer as stuck when we feel there is no free thinking anymore. Everything is heavy. It doesn't yield. It's not as soft anymore. It becomes unyielding. You will not have the same chance of learning, because learning is such a factor that doesn't either fit into the classical model. Because there you only have the acquisition of firmly pre-established things, ordained by a pre-ordered reality that plays out by itself and a priori decided, exactly as how the classical laws of physics are depicted. Law-bound, unyielding, firm, eternally unchanging. They simply don't make any sense. It is not like they are wrong. No, that's not the way to approach them. They couldn't be right, nor could they be wrong. They simply are what Wittgenstein would call private language, an attempt to say or think something that is not even making sense for oneself. It's a little bit like playing football with 23 imagined other players, an imagined goal. Then you have no corollary. You have no check, you have no point, Witz, and you wouldn't know if you're correct or not. And therefore, you wouldn't have any reality to it. It's the sharedness with other things and other people that makes for any possibility of reality. Participating is what is the real substance of the atoms. That is the pure arche, participation, doing point. Whereas just exist doesn't make for any reality whatsoever. And that is determined from the outset. And that's why the whole idea of unmovable laws, either in language, the universal grammar of Noam Chomsky, and all the varieties, which is the most common, the majority of linguists or philosophers of language are in that region, will make it impossible for any understanding to come in. Any change will be blocked out by the very idea of the laws. Lee Smolin and Roberto Unger, which I mentioned so many times before, said that the most limiting on all knowledge, not at all only about the universe, is that you can understand something outside of itself. In their example, it's the universe itself, and it's called the cosmological fallacy, but it applies to everything. And having the cosmological fallacy, you will have that fallacy in your own thinking, in your own life. And it would rid you of the possibility to participate, be in the game. Being outside the language game means that you are no longer participating. And the things that comes out won't be real anymore. They will have less reality to them. They're not in the game. And there I change and end this game. Thank you very much for listening in. Have a very pleasant day, morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Bye.